young man. As always.
Welcome to this Brandt lecture this evening. I'm Mark Bannister. I'm Interim Dean of the Boise State University College of Business and Economics, and I welcome you here. This is a very interesting presentation tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to it. But before we get to our presentation, I want to first ask everybody to silence your cell phones. We'll try to avoid our interruptions from our electronic friends tonight. But our next step is for me to express gratitude, very deep gratitude, to the John and Ora Brandt Foundation. That the Brandt Foundation makes this event possible and is very supportive of this lecture and other very important activities that enhance discussion and thought, and particularly that applied to free enterprise. John and Ora Brandt's extraordinary lives and commitment to their community, described in tonight's program, continue to make a significant contribution to the people of Idaho. And I'd like to acknowledge trustees, some of which are here tonight and some of which are not. First, Don Brandt is not able to be here, but we certainly appreciate his very deep dedication. Bob Rathborn, Lawrence Gray, Judge J.R. Schiller, Don Anderson, John Barnes, and Mike Segersma. We also want to thank the community and supporters that have supported this event, have come out to this event, and others, and so I also want to thank the students and the faculty that are here as well. Also, we have a person that has put a significant number of hours, a lot of hard work, a lot of thought into making this event possible. And that's Alan Dalton, who's a member of the Economics Department and manager of the Brandt Lecture Series. Alan, thank you so much, and I'll turn the podium over to you and let you introduce tonight's speaker.
Well, thank you, Dean Bannister, and thank all of you for coming out tonight to listen to tonight's 13th Brandt Foundation lecture. The very first lecture was given by a Nobel laureate. It was a good way to kick off this event, and we've had good speakers every year since then, except for the year that Hurricane Sandy kept one of our speakers in New York City. For those who came in late and didn't hear the announcement, if you have a cell phone, please make sure you silence it now. At the conclusion of tonight's talk, there will be a question and answer period. Once that begins, there are two microphones, one here and one here near the front, where you can proceed to and ask your questions. Students from the Masters of Economics and Masters of Business Administration programs here at Boise State will be there to assist you with the microphone. I would ask that the questions be as brief as possible to allow others time to ask their questions, and I would also ask that your comments be questions rather than monologues. And you know what a question is, right? You've all been through college, or at least partway through. Those are the statements that end with a question mark. If you leave early, we would ask that you do so quietly so that those who remain for Q&A are not disturbed. And as you leave the lecture tonight, we also ask that you leave a filled out feedback form that's inside your program. We do look at those. We don't always take your suggestions, but we do look at them and offer suggestions for the next speaker. You'll note, for example, that the slides that will be in our speaker's presentation tonight are black on white. Last year's speaker had black background with colored fonts, and it was very difficult to read. So those with extra credit slips, and I know there's a few of you here earning extra credit, can deposit those in a box that another MBA student will have at the exit. And for those of who attended the VIP reception, don't forget to drop off your VIP badges in another box. So biographical information for tonight's speaker is in your program that was left at your seat, and it's also on the Brandt Foundation's website at boisestate.edu. I'm not going to talk about Will's biography. I'm going to talk briefly about the ideas. The purpose of the Brandt Foundation lecture series is to bring to Idaho those who are making important contributions to public understanding of the foundations of a free and prosperous society. One such foundation is a monetary system that provides both stability in value and flexibility to meet variations in household demand for money. In February 2009, somebody who claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto began the Bitcoin project as an attempt to provide stability and value that he felt that the Federal Reserve and other central banks had been unable to provide over their history. So tonight our speaker will evaluate whether Bitcoin has succeeded. Is Bitcoin intrinsically worthless? Can Bitcoin become a major currency? Or is Bitcoin a bubble? Those are, by the way, titles of 3 different papers that tonight's speaker has written. William Luther is Assistant Professor of Economics at Florida Atlantic University, Director of the American Institute for Economic Research's Sound Money Project, and an adjunct scholar with the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. His research specializes in questions of currency acceptance, including acceptance of cryptocurrencies. He's author of several articles that have appeared in leading scholarly journals, such as the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Economic Inquiry, and Public Choice, and his popular works have appeared in The Economist, Forbes, U.S. News and World Report. He even had an appearance on Al Jazeera. The Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is honored to present tonight's speaker, William Luther, and his topic is Bitcoin a Bubble. Please join me.
So it may be an understatement to say that the price of Bitcoin has fluctuated quite a bit in the last year or so. Let's see if we can. There we go. So you can see, right, in April, one Bitcoin was trading around $1,348. Then in December, it shot up to over $19,000. Before then falling. Today, it's around $6,400. So that is a lot of fluctuation, huge swings in the price, and naturally, that has gotten some of us scratching our heads. What is this thing called Bitcoin? What is its fundamental value? Why does anybody want it to begin with? Why isn't the price just zero? And given that the price isn't zero, why has its price fluctuated so much over a relatively short period of time? So what I want to do tonight is just address those 3 questions, those 3 basic questions. What is Bitcoin? What is the fundamental value of Bitcoin? And why has its price fluctuated? I'll start with the basic question in hopes that by the time we get to the more complicated questions, we're all on the same page and we can reach those more advanced arguments. So what is a Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is an unbacked digital currency. So we need to break that down a bit. It's digital. I know some of you are probably looking at these slides. You can see the physical coins in the background, and you're thinking, what do you mean it's digital? That's clearly a physical coin. These physical coins aren't actually Bitcoin. They're tokens. You can see on some of those coins a holographic seal. They're on the backs of those coins. And if you peel back that holographic seal, you'll actually find the digital address where that balance of Bitcoin is located. And so a Bitcoin is fundamentally digital. It's a digital, an unbacked digital cryptocurrency. So what do we mean by unbacked? By unbacked, we mean that it's not redeemable for some other asset. That makes it a lot like the monies that we're familiar with using, like dollars or euros or the yuan. It's not redeemable for some other asset. If you take a $20 bill to your local bank, they'll happily exchange that for 2 10s or 4 5s, but it's not redeemable for some other asset. You can't get, say, gold or silver. There's no contractual obligation to redeem that for some underlying commodity. And it's very much the same with Bitcoin. It's an unbacked digital money, so there's no contractual obligation to redeem Bitcoin for some other asset. It's worth what people are willing to pay for it. It's exchangeable, but not redeemable. So the question is whether anyone is willing to pay anything for it or not. Now, Bitcoin is an unbacked digital money, but actually the most interesting about Bitcoin is the way in which it processes payments. Now, if you're like most people, you don't think about payments being processed at all. And so let's just think briefly about 3 ways that we might process a particular transaction. One that's perhaps the simplest to understand is a cash transaction. A cash transaction is if I were to pay you, say, $15 for lunch. I hand you a balance of $15. You receive that balance of $15. This is what we call a decentralized clearing mechanism because the transaction gets cleared between you and I. We don't have to rely on some trusted third party to clear this transaction. When I pull that $15 out of my wallet, you can see it. You know that I own that balance of dollars. When I hand you the $15, you receive it. Right? The balance gets transferred from me to you. When you feel it leave my hands, something very important happens. I am no longer in a position to spend that balance of $15 again because I've relinquished ownership of that balance. You now own that balance of dollars. So that's a decentralized clearing mechanism. We can also think about digital transactions. So the problem with digital transactions is it's not physical. And so we need someone to clear this transaction. Think about, to see this problem, think about like an MP3, a song. Right? If I transfer an MP3 to you, I don't have to relinquish ownership to that MP3. You have the song file, I have the song file, we both have the song file. That makes for pretty terrible money. That's like me paying you $15 and keeping $15. Right, so we need someone to process this transaction, to confirm that I have this digital balance, to transfer that digital balance to you, and importantly, make sure that I no longer have access to that digital balance so that I can't spend it again. Now, I happen to bank at Chase. If you're a Chase customer and I were to pay you with, say, a $15 check, those here in the front understand what a check is. In the back, if I were to swipe my debit card for $15, Chase would process this transaction between us. What would they do? They would confirm that I have a balance of $15. They would debit my account and credit yours. That is, they would act as a central clearinghouse for this transaction. Now, suppose you don't bank at Chase. Suppose you bank at, say, Bank of America. Well, much the same thing happens. It's just that now, instead of this happening at our bank, it happens one layer up. Maybe the clearinghouse interbank payment system or Fedwire clears this transaction, but the same thing happens. Chase's account gets debited, Bank of America's account gets credited, and we have a central clearinghouse to make sure that this transaction gets processed, and I can't spend that balance again. Bitcoin is digital, but it doesn't clear transactions like this. Instead, it relies on the entire network to process a transaction. We don't use a decentralized clearing mechanism or a centralized clearing mechanism. Instead, we use a distributed clearing mechanism. And so it's the entire protocol that processes the transaction. And that is a new and radically different technology that did not exist prior to the launch of Bitcoin in 2009. So let me say a bit about how a Bitcoin transaction is processed. At the core of the Bitcoin protocol is what's known as the blockchain. And this is a public ledger of all past transactions. And so if you own a balance of Bitcoin, there's an address there on the blockchain that is the balance of Bitcoin that you own. So you can think of it as like a shared ledger that all of us have. And so if I want to make a transaction, I announce to the system that I have a balance of Bitcoin that I want to send to you. The equivalent of, say, $15 for lunch. And that transaction is grouped together with all the other transactions that are taking place in roughly a 10-minute window. into a block of transactions. And then the entire system, everyone running the Bitcoin protocol, begins racing to be the first user to process this batch of transactions. That is, to add this batch of transactions to the blockchain. So what's going on there? Well, this block of transactions, right? The transactions are blocked together, and then the miners are essentially confirming that transaction as legitimate. They're updating that ledger. They're debiting my account and crediting your account. And then once they do that, you can spend that balance of Bitcoin to someone else, and the process repeats itself. So these transactions, they're blocked together and then added to the blockchain, thereby updating that public ledger. So that's Bitcoin in a very brief form. And we'll say a bit more about this process of processing transactions as some of these issues become a little more important. All right, so we have a general sense of what Bitcoin is. We need to consider why it's valuable at all. Why is it that people are willing to hand over their hard-earned cash for Bitcoin? Right? What are you going to do with it? So I think that it's useful to first consider two bad arguments for why Bitcoin is valuable. Bad arguments which unfortunately we'll hear from time to time if you're perusing the internet. The first is that Bitcoin is valuable because it's costly to produce. Now, there's some truth to this argument. Bitcoin is costly to produce. Remember that I said that the system is, every user on the system that's running the Bitcoin protocol, they're racing to process a balance of transactions. And that's costly to do. You have to use some electricity. You have to run an expensive mining rig. Right? And so that's costly to do. In order to get users to run this protocol and process transactions, they have to have an incentive to do that. They have to have a reason to process these transactions. And the reason they do that is because the first user to process a batch of transactions is rewarded with some new Bitcoin. In the first 4 years, this was 50 Bitcoin per block of transactions. 4 years after that, it fell. The second 4-year period, it was 25 Bitcoin. The moment it's 12.5 Bitcoin. So every 4 years, this reward gets cut in half. So every time a block of transactions gets processed, the person, the computer that processes this batch of transactions, receives 12.5 Bitcoin at the moment. Okay, so they have an incentive to do this. And so some folks will say that the reason Bitcoin is valuable is because they incur these costs in order to process this batch of transactions. But in fact, this gets the causation exactly the wrong way around. It's not that Bitcoin is valuable because it's costly to produce. Rather, it's that these miners, as they're called, those folks who are processing these transactions, they incur those costs because they believe that the Bitcoin they will receive is valuable. And so I tell my students, never reason from cost to value, always reason from value to cost. The reason that these miners are incurring electricity costs, they're buying these expensive rigs, is because doing so will enable them to acquire valuable Bitcoin. So we can't explain that value by pointing to the cost if the value is the source of those costs. So you can think of it like a doctor. Sometimes you'll hear people speak, hopefully non-economists, but you'll hear people say, well, the reason that doctors are so expensive is because they have to go to school for so long. Again, a grain of truth there. Doctors do spend a lot of time in school. Medical expenses, they are expensive. But it's not expensive because the doctor spends so long in school. Right? Rather, it's that doctors spend a lot of time in school because they believe that at the end of that process, they'll be able to provide some valuable medical expertise that people are willing to pay for. If plumbers spent that long in school, right, we wouldn't suddenly be willing to pay more for plumbing services, right? We would think that someone's foolish for spending 12 years in school to be a plumber, right? The reason that doctors incur those costs, their time costs, is because they believe that their services will be valuable at the end. So it's the same with Bitcoin. So there's a grain of truth here. Bitcoin is costly to produce, but that's not the source of the value. Rather, the value is the source of the cost. So we've got to keep looking for the value. There's a second popular answer, which I think is wrong, is that Bitcoin is valuable because of speculative demand. Speculative demand for Bitcoin. And again, there's a grain of truth here. Is there speculative demand for Bitcoin? Absolutely. Certainly. It would be hard to imagine there not being speculative demand for Bitcoin. Why is that? Because there is speculative demand for everything. We live in a very uncertain world. Right? There are very few things in our life that we know with absolute certainty. And so we are left in almost every question in our lives speculating. Right? Some of you are here to get a degree, right? Presumably on the idea that when you finish that degree, you'll be able to get some job that you couldn't have gotten otherwise, and that the expenses and time foregone today will make it worthwhile, right? That will be worthwhile costs because the job that you'll get will be sufficiently better. Do you know that with absolute certainty? No. Do you know exactly what job you'll get or what your starting salary will be? Certainly not. You're speculating. It's a pretty safe bet, by the way. But it's an act of speculation nonetheless. If you open up a bakery, right, presumably you're thinking that you're going to get some people to hand over their hard-earned cash for your fresh baked bread. Do you know that they're going to do that? No, not with certainty. You're speculating. And so I don't find this argument that Bitcoin's valuable because of speculative demand, because everything is always an act of speculation. What we want to ask is, why are people speculating? What's the basis for that speculation? Is there some reasonable expectation for that speculation, like there is for something like education or starting up a bakery? Bitcoin is useful, it's valuable, because it's useful or it's expected to be useful. And the only use that Bitcoin has is as a medium of exchange. You can transfer your wealth to anyone, virtually anywhere around the world, relatively quickly and at a relatively low cost. And so if Bitcoin is valuable, it's only valuable because it's useful as a medium of exchange. And so when we're thinking about the fundamental value of Bitcoin or why Bitcoin is valuable, we need to think about whether and to what extent it's useful as a medium of exchange. So let's think about some characteristics of Bitcoin that might make it more or less useful than other payment mechanisms we have access to for particular transactions for particular people. And we should say at the outset, we don't want to commit the all or nothing fallacy. Right? We don't want to think that Bitcoin is either everything, it's going to be the only currency that any of us use for any transaction, or it's nothing, it's worthless. Right? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. We want to know, are there some transactions where this is a better payment mechanism than our existing technologies? If so, then it has a useful role to play as a medium of exchange. So let's think about some characteristics of Bitcoin. One is that it's global. So you can make international transactions more cheaply than you can with traditional payment mechanisms. This is especially important if you happen to have been born in a country like China that has exchange rate controls and capital flow controls, right? And so in some countries like China, you're not allowed to transfer some of your wealth abroad. In other countries like Argentina, you can transfer it abroad. You can convert to, say, US dollars, but you have to do so at the exchange rate that the government sets, and it's not a very favorable exchange rate for you. And so if you have access to a payment technology that allows you to transfer your wealth anywhere around the world, that might be very valuable if your existing payment mechanisms don't allow you to do that. Perhaps you're working in the US, but your family is living in, say, Guatemala or Honduras. You want to send some funds back. Traditionally, how would you have done that? Well, you would have relied on some service like Western Union. And they will happily send that transaction for you, but they do so at a relatively high fee. And so with Bitcoin, there's some potential that you can make that same transaction at a lower fee. Right? And so that makes it a marginally better payment mechanism for those kind of transactions. Again, not necessarily for all transactions, but for some transactions. Bitcoin is also pseudonymous. So let's go back to what Bitcoin is. Right? It's digital, it's a shared ledger, and that blockchain has all of these addresses on it, which signify that you own some balance of Bitcoin. But those addresses don't need to be linked to your personal identity. And so it's at least conceivable that you would acquire a balance of Bitcoin that's not linked to your real world identity. And if you transfer that balance of Bitcoin to someone else, no one needs to know that you've made that transaction. So it's pseudonymous. Your real name isn't associated with that. Now, I use the term pseudonymous and not, say, anonymous, or I might use the term quasi-anonymous, because it's not perfectly anonymous. Right? With any transaction, there's usually a point in that transaction. So if you're buying or selling a good or service where the actual goods or services get exchanged. And at that point, your identity is usually available. Right? And so a third party witnessing the exchange would know that you're involved in that transaction. The person handing over or receiving the goods or services in that transaction would know you're a party to that transaction. So you're not strictly speaking anonymous, but it permits you to engage in some pseudonymous exchange, to rely on your pseudonym as opposed to your actual name, and obscures your identity for some transactions. Well, why might this be useful? Well, it might be useful if you're purchasing pot. That was one of the big use cases in the beginning. Right, the Silk Road was an early site that only allowed transactions in Bitcoin, and the reality is that most of the illegal substances and services that were being sold on the site was marijuana. Right, so legal in some states, not legal in others. And in places where it's illegal, you might not want to, say, announce to your bank that you're engaged in this illegal transaction. So I'll tell you a quick story. I'm originally from Ohio. We have a very famous former mayor of Cincinnati in Ohio. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He had a daytime talk show. His name was Jerry Springer. Jerry Springer once paid a hooker with a check. Now, I bet you're wondering, how is it that I know that Jerry Springer paid a hooker with a check? Well, I know because he paid her with a check. This is not a pseudonymous payment mechanism. It turns out that at some point in the future, the bank can go back and say, yep, paid her with a check. Right? And so your identity is out in the open there. Right? And so if you're engaged in illegal transactions, you might not want to use a payment mechanism like a debit card or a check where your identity is available. But some of you might be thinking, well, okay, so is Bitcoin only useful for criminals and tax cheats? No, absolutely not. Most of us value financial privacy. I think of three spheres of financial privacy. Right, so there's one sphere of financial privacy. Perhaps you share a bank account with a spouse or partner and you're buying their birthday gift or Christmas gift. You probably don't use your card for that because then it's kind of tacky. They see what you purchased and how much you paid. You want some financial privacy for those transactions. Right, maybe you don't want the companies you're engaged with, right, knowing what you're purchasing. Right? And so if that's the case, then you might want some financial privacy there. Maybe you make the transaction in cash. And perhaps one of the more important realms of financial privacy is when you're in a situation where you're making a transaction, you're not sure that maybe it's a perfectly legitimate transaction, but it would put you in a bad position with your government. So maybe you happen to be born in Venezuela and you're not a big fan of the Maduro regime and you want to make a political contribution to the opposition party. Probably not a good idea to use a check. Right? And so there are certainly places around the world where you can find yourself in hot water pretty quickly if you're not using some privacy-enhancing measures. And so cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin allows you to make those anonymous, quasi-anonymous transactions. Here's another, transaction costs. Bitcoin is not subject to what's called chargeback fraud. Chargeback fraud. So if you go out for a nice steak dinner tonight, swipe your card, wake up in the morning, you think, maybe I shouldn't have done that. You call Visa or MasterCard, you can say, well, I didn't order that second bottle of wine. And oftentimes they'll reverse the transaction and they'll hit the merchant with the fee on the way out. Right? But with Bitcoin, once you sign over that balance of Bitcoin, you've signed it over. You can't call that back. And so the merchant is no longer liable for chargeback fraud. That lowers the cost of transacting. And so that might be a useful reason to use Bitcoin. And finally, there's a predictable supply. So I mentioned that miners receive some new Bitcoin when they process a batch of transactions, new Bitcoin that never existed before. And more importantly, perhaps, is that the difficulty of solving the computational problem to process that batch of transactions varies. It varies such that one block of transactions gets processed every 10 minutes. And so there's a predictable amount of Bitcoin that enters circulation every 10 minutes. What that means is that we can map out the supply of Bitcoin for any particular point in time in the future, and we can be very confident within roughly a 2-week window how many Bitcoin will be in circulation given that built-in algorithm. That makes for a very predictable supply. Now, the Federal Reserve does a pretty good job at managing the US dollar relative to other central banks around the world. But if you were to ask me to pinpoint what the monetary base will be 6 months from now or a year from now, let alone 100 years from now, I would have a pretty difficult time doing that. Certainly couldn't do that with the predictability that I can with Bitcoin. So some people value that, and so that predictable supply is another potential use. Okay, so there are some reasons why we might want to transact with Bitcoin, and so there's some source of value, some fundamental value of Bitcoin. Why is it the price fluctuates so much? Why is it that the price fluctuates so much? Well, the first thing we need to keep in mind is that Bitcoin is a medium of exchange, and media of exchange are subject to what's called network effects. So many of you have cell phones, but I'm guessing that none of you would want a cell phone if you were the only person who had a cell phone or any kind of phone. Right? Not a very useful technology if you can't call other people, if there aren't other people in the phone network. It's much the same with money. It's not very useful to use a money if no one else accepts that money. And the more people that accept a particular money, the more useful that money is as a medium of exchange. And so we want to be in a network that lots of other people are in. And so we have to estimate what the current and future network size of Bitcoin will be. And that's difficult to do. It's difficult to do. And it's made more difficult by potential shocks to this system that we're getting. One, because there's no government support for Bitcoin. So there's no built-in demand for Bitcoin. The US dollar has government support. The US government supports the US dollar. That means that taxes are going to be paid in dollars, and the US government is credibly committed to make all of its expenditures in dollars. And so we can be reasonably confident when we're accepting dollars that if no one else accepts dollars, the US government is going to accept dollars. That's a big, stable source of demand. Right? Roughly 25% of GDP. Right? That's a big source of demand. We don't have to worry about the US government not accepting dollars. And of course, since we can count on that source of demand, then we're more likely to use that medium of exchange. And still other people can be confident in accepting that medium of exchange because they know that we are not likely to exit that network, and so on and so forth. So Bitcoin doesn't have that big stable source of demand, and so the range of fluctuation in demand is so much bigger. You can have a network with everyone in it or no one in it. Right? With the US dollar, you can have a network with everyone in it or only the US government in it. And so there's just a bigger range of fluctuation in demand for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is also, it's imperfectly designed. It faces what's called a scalability problem at the moment. So I told you that roughly every 10 minutes a block of transactions gets processed. The size of those blocks is actually capped. It's capped. And since there's one block every 10 minutes, and since all the transactions go into a block, that effectively amounts to a cap on the number of transactions that can be processed in a 10-minute window. Specifically, it means that Bitcoin can process somewhere between 3.3 and 7 transactions per second. That's pretty small. For comparison, Visa processes around 1,667 transactions per second. 3 to 7? That's not even enough to process all the Uber transactions in the economy, let alone a global payment system. It's just very small. Now, there were proposals on the moment to increase this block size, or segregated witness was a protocol adoption that was implemented about a year ago. So there are proposals to make Bitcoin be able to process more transactions, but in order for those proposals to go through, a majority of the miners on the system have to accept this change, and they have to update their software to reflect this change. And so we can't be confident that they're actually going to do that. And all the time we're getting new information about whether we're more likely or less likely to overcome this scalability problem. When we get new information that tells us that we're more likely to overcome this scalability problem, that means that our estimates of the future network size of Bitcoin is bigger, and so it's a more valuable medium of exchange in the future, so we're willing to pay more for it today. And when we get more information that suggests that scalability problem isn't going to be solved, it means that the future network size of Bitcoin is probably smaller than we expected, and so we're not willing to pay as much for that today. And so as we get new information on that, how we're going to deal with that scalability problem, the price of Bitcoin fluctuates. Another big source of disturbance is what I call regulatory ambiguity. So governments around the world can put in policies that are either quite favorable to cryptocurrencies or policies that dissuade people from using cryptocurrencies. And there's a big range of policies that have been adopted. In the US, the government has been pretty accommodating. Right? If you're an exchange, you have to register as a money services business, but it's certainly not banned, and it's not even heavily regulated. So the regulatory pressure has been pretty light. In other countries, in China, for example, exchanges, Bitcoin exchanges, places where you can exchange the yuan for Bitcoin and vice versa, have been banned. Right? They've been banned. And so that makes it difficult to exchange yuan for Bitcoin and Bitcoin for yuan. That means that it's less likely that a Chinese person is going to be in the Bitcoin network than if it were easy to exchange yuan for Bitcoin and vice versa. And so when that ban went into effect, what should we expect to happen? Well, we think that the network size of Bitcoin is going to be smaller, and so it's a less valuable medium of exchange, and so the price should fall. Right? A proposal was put in place, was offered in Russia, but hasn't been passed to ban Bitcoin outright. It's technically illegal to use currencies other than the ruble in Russia. Bitcoin is a currency other than the ruble. So you might think, well, it's illegal to use Bitcoin as well. But they can use international monies for international transactions. But there was a specific proposal to ban Bitcoin in Russia, even for international transactions. That didn't go through, but some people worried that will still go through. And as we get new information about whether that policy will pass or fail, we update our expectations of the future network size of Bitcoin. In Bangladesh, one of my favorite examples, you can spend 12 years in prison if you're caught using Bitcoin. That's like the far extreme of the regulatory response to Bitcoin. Most of us are not willing to spend time in prison over our choice of currencies, and so naturally we should expect very few Bangladeshis in the cryptocurrency market. And so the network size is smaller than it otherwise would be, and the price reflects that. Even in the US, remember I mentioned that we have a pretty lax regulatory environment for cryptocurrencies, but I should have mentioned this. With the scalability problem, this also pushes up the fees of Bitcoin. So last December, when the scalability problem was perhaps at its peak, the segregated witness proposal hadn't been adopted very widely, and fees got up to over $30 per transaction. So that's kind of an issue. Even in the US, as I was saying, there's a wide range of policy outcomes. And so there are only, I believe, 9 states that have what Coin Center has described as clear and narrowly tailored regulations to deal with Bitcoin. Idaho, by the way, is one of them. Congratulations. Most states have unclear regulations. It's not really clear how those states are going to deal with particular aspects of cryptocurrency use. And so all the time we're getting new information about whether states are going to clarify their laws or leave them more opaque, and so this is going to affect the price of Bitcoin. So let's get to the big question here. Is Bitcoin a bubble? Well, economists define a bubble as a situation where the price of an asset exceeds its fundamental value. Right? In other words, you're paying more for an asset than it's worth. And so it's really difficult to say whether Bitcoin is a bubble. If you take nothing away from this talk tonight, that's what I hope you take away. It is difficult to know whether Bitcoin is a bubble because we don't observe the fundamental value. Now, what a lot of people do is just look at the price. They say, the price shoots up, it must be a bubble. If the price falls markedly, they say, must have been a bubble. But we don't define bubbles by fluctuation in price. We define a bubble as a case where the price exceeds the fundamental value. And so before we can conclude that an asset is a bubble, we have to ask whether or not we can explain that price volatility by changes in the fundamental value. And I think we can, right? Because Bitcoin is a network item, it matters how many people are in that network, right? We have a big source of potential outcomes there. And because we're constantly getting new information about how big that future network size will be, how much we're willing to pay for Bitcoin today is going to fluctuate quite a bit as well. And finally, since the supply of Bitcoin is effectively fixed, we get no change in supply to accommodate those changes in demands. And so the result is huge swings in the price of Bitcoin, which doesn't tell us that Bitcoin is a bubble. It just tells us that the price of Bitcoin is volatile. Now, might I be wrong about this? Absolutely. Perhaps the price of Bitcoin falls to zero tomorrow, or perhaps it shoots to the moon. All I'm saying is that our best guess of the future network value of Bitcoin is the price we observe today. This is the price that people who are placing bets in the market, who are putting money where their mouth is, right? This is the price that they're settling on. And you or I, we don't seem to have better information about the world we're living in. And so that should be our best guess of what the fundamental value of Bitcoin is. All right, that'll do it for me. I'm looking forward to your questions.
So if you have a question, come to the mic. I'd like to start off, okay, with the question. It relates to one of your papers, and that is, do you ever think Bitcoin will become a major currency because of its supply issues?
So I think that there are pros and cons to the supply of Bitcoin. On the one hand, as I mentioned, is a very stable, very predictable supply. And so we can be reasonably confident what that is at any point in the future. On the other hand, we probably want money for macroeconomic reasons, to avoid recessions and to avoid unsustainable booms. We probably want a money that has a demand, that has a supply that expands and contracts to accommodate changes in demand. Bitcoin is the antithesis of that, right? Its supply is not elastic at all. It's essentially a fixed supply. And so if the demand for Bitcoin increases, there's no offsetting increase in supply of Bitcoin. It's just big run up in the price of Bitcoin. If the demand for Bitcoin falls, there's no reduction in the supply of Bitcoin. There's just a fall in the price of Bitcoin. And so for macroeconomic reasons, I think we want a more elastic currency than Bitcoin. And so that certainly could prevent people from adopting a Bitcoin, because it might be more prone to promote booms or recessions than otherwise would be the case. Now the question is always compared to what? Right? If you're in a country where the central bank manages the supply of money pretty well, that is, it increases the supply to offset changes in money demand, then you wouldn't want to switch to Bitcoin. But on the other hand, if you're in a country that completely mismanages its money, you might be looking for an alternative. And one alternative is Bitcoin. So I think that could go either way.
Well, let me ask John Hall of Boise, how are cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, going to affect U.S. economic sanctions on Iran?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, we prohibit the extent to which Iran can engage in international transactions, and we do this more broadly as well. We basically say, do you like dealing with American banks? Would you like to continue dealing with American banks? Then you can't deal with Iran. And so this is how we enforce sanctions on Iran. And so, right, since Bitcoin is a global payment mechanism, and since it's pseudonymous, it's at least conceivable that folks in Iran could get around this sanction by using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. We had a similar situation in Venezuela. In Venezuela, the Venezuelan government issued its own cryptocurrency, the petrol, because it was having a difficult time transacting internationally in dollars because of sanctions. And so what will the effect of cryptocurrencies be? Well, it makes avoiding those sanctions a bit easier than it otherwise would be. But it turns out that it doesn't eliminate our ability to, it doesn't enable us to get around those sanctions entirely, because you still need to get into or out of the Bitcoin system. Bitcoin exchanges, certainly in the US, are registered as money services businesses. They have to comply with know your customer laws. And so it's not all that easy for Iranians to get Bitcoin without revealing their identity. And when they make transactions with US companies, those US companies have to be concerned that the link between them and the Iranian customers will be detected, or suppliers will be detected at some point, and they'll still be subject to those sanctions. And so this basically amounts to saying that pseudonymous is not anonymous. There's a difference there, and so it's still risky, and so it's not an easy workaround. Maybe the best example of that is a domestic example. Ross William Albrecht, who's the founder, the convicted founder of the Silk Road, that website I was telling you about where for a few years you could purchase pot online using Bitcoin, he's currently in prison. He's in prison. His Bitcoin was confiscated by the FBI. The U.S. Marshal Service auctioned off that Bitcoin a few years later. He was pseudonymous, but not anonymous. And once your identity is tied to a balance of Bitcoin, you can trace that back through the ledger, which is publicly available, and you can see all of those transactions that you made in the past. Now, those transactions, the other parties are pseudonymous as well, but the folks who are interested in this are very interested in figuring out who these pseudonymous individuals are. And so some identities, like Coinbase, one of the popular exchanges, has been tied to some balances of Bitcoin, and so we know when you're transacting with Coinbase. And Coinbase has to comply with know your customer laws, and so if you're transacting with Coinbase, they have to know who you are. And so pseudonymous is not anonymous. And so you got to be very careful about that. A question over here?
Is this working? I'm trying to think of the right words here. I'm going to use the word misleading, but I don't want it to be construed as negative. Well, kind of negative. So don't you think it's a bit misleading? You keep on comparing Bitcoin's price to USD and fiat currency, but when the price, in your terms, was spiking, the amount of Satoshis never changed.
That's right.
So you're comparing Bitcoin to fiat, but don't you think you're missing the whole parallel financial system that's being built around cryptocurrency by saying that the value of Bitcoin is always able to be measured in USD?
Well, I think that you're right. We could put those same slides in terms of British pounds or in terms of chicken dinners.
No, I'm talking about Satoshis. Satoshis only. Like comparing other cryptocurrencies to each other.
Sure. So we can think about the Bitcoin price of Ethereum and the Ethereum price of any other altcoin. Yeah, so we have exchanges. The point is just that there are two things that reflect the price. Regardless of how we measure that price, there are two things that affect the price. One is changes in the supply of the item in question, right? And for Bitcoin, that's essentially fixed. For traditional fiat monies, it's not fixed, and boy, has it not been fixed, right? In some places, it's not been fixed a lot. Look at hyperinflation in Venezuela at the moment, places like Zimbabwe in the late 2000s, huge increases in supply. You're not going to get that with Bitcoin. But the other source of price volatility is changes in demand. for Bitcoin, that's the only source of price volatility. So it doesn't matter what we're measuring that exchange rate in, whether it's dollars or turkeys, right? Whatever it is, the volatility is going to reflect changes in supply or changes in demand. And so that's what I want to highlight there, the fact that there are these sources of demand disturbances in the market for Bitcoin.
So earlier you had mentioned kind of one of the key pillars of it that kind of a lot of people were attracted to was its quasi-anonymous nature. And you had also mentioned with one of the past answers that there's Coinbase, and there is a way eventually to kind of connect the spender to what they had purchased. But just because it's so increasingly difficult to connect those, how likely do you see government embracing Bitcoin just because they would have difficulty taxing transactions?
Well, actually, the IRS subpoenaed Coinbase. They initiated this subpoena a little over a year ago, I think. It was just upheld finally, and so Coinbase turned over records for its customers, and so those customers certainly have to comply with the IRS. It's difficult to track who's transacting with Bitcoin, but not impossible. And that's the same thing could be said with cash, but the IRS prosecutes people who aren't paying their taxes because they're involved in cash transactions all the time, right? They look at the assets that they actually own, big houses, big cars, relative to the incomes that they're reporting. You can do that for a business that's primarily engaged in cash transactions, and you can do that for a business that's primarily engaged in Bitcoin transactions. So that's fundamentally the same problem for the IRS that they already face with paper monies that the U.S. government produces. Now over here.
One of the biggest problems with Bitcoin seems to be that people take their government-backed currencies and put it into it, and then as soon as the value of Bitcoin goes up, they pull their money out of it. And so is that one of the reasons why you see the big fluctuations? And then in addition, what do you think is the solution for people to actually keep their money in Bitcoin or in a cryptocurrency and actually use it in everyday lifestyle? Would that be acceptance in stores or I don't know, something like Apple Pay?
Yeah, so I'll say most people actually hold very little, even folks like me who transact from time to time in Bitcoin, hold very little Bitcoin at any particular point in time, and in part because the price is pretty volatile, right? You don't want your wealth to fluctuate very much over a short period of time. And you can have all of the transaction benefits of using Bitcoin without actually holding any Bitcoin. How do you do that? Well, you hold your wealth in some more stable asset, like dollars. And then when you want to make a Bitcoin transaction, you convert those dollars to Bitcoin, you send the Bitcoin wherever you want it to go, and the seller on the other side of that transaction can then cash out into dollars. And so you or I, we don't have to hold Bitcoin and be subject to that volatility. Instead, we can rely on intermediaries like Coinbase, but other exchanges as well, to hold that Bitcoin in the interim and bear the risk of the fluctuations. And to the extent that they're involved in more transactions than you or I are in, they're in a better position to absorb that risk. So sometimes they experience the upside of that risk, and sometimes they experience the downside of that risk. This largely cancels out since they're involved in so many transactions. And so how do we get Bitcoin? How do we get more people to hold Bitcoin? Well, one way would be to have, if the purchasing power were more stable than it is today, and that would likely be the case if the demand for Bitcoin were bigger. How do we get a bigger demand for Bitcoin? Well, we make it a lot more useful than it is at present. So some companies are very much involved in increasing the ability to make transactions quite easily with Bitcoin. Some companies have offered debit cards that you can swipe at traditional merchant channels, traditional merchant terminals, and then your balance of Bitcoin is debited. And so I compare this to, say, going to Germany and buying a cup of coffee and paying with your U.S. debit card. Right? You're paying with dollars, but your bank transforms that dollars into euros, and then the seller receives euros. It's the same if you swipe your Bitcoin-denominated debit card, right? Some intermediaries, you're paying with Bitcoin. Some intermediaries exchanging those Bitcoins for whatever the currency that the seller would like to use, and then the seller receives that currency. And of course, if more people can make transactions this way, then more people are accepting Bitcoin, and that makes it possible to make more Bitcoin-to-Bitcoin transactions without the intermediary, which means more people will hold Bitcoin. And it's not just Bitcoin, of course. Every cryptocurrency faces this network effects problem. But making it easy to make transactions with Bitcoin is the surest way to increase its demand.
Good evening. With the public ledger technology available with a blockchain, do you think we could ever apply that to the voting system?
Well, so there are some companies, there's at least one company that's proposing something like that. There are a lot of applications for the blockchain technology. So regardless of whether or not Bitcoin survives, I think that it's safe to say that this blockchain technology will persist in many different forms, because it's just a way of updating a ledger without relying on a trusted third party, right? And so there are lots of ledgers that we have. Many of you probably own a car. I assume here in Idaho you have that car registered with the state of Idaho. That means that there's a ledger of car titles and you can transact with those car titles, that is, transfer it to someone else. And so potentially this is something we could put on a blockchain instead of going down to your courthouse and hoping that the person behind the desk accurately transfers your title. We could do this digitally with a blockchain using our private keys. Seems like a reasonable approach. Whether that would go to voting, I'm not sure. I think many states were still using paper ballots until very recently. Maybe some of them still are. So we're reluctant to change things like voting. And so I don't know that I would put that as a front runner for something that we will put on the blockchain. But there are certainly a lot of uses. If you use a ledger, there's some potential role for a blockchain. Now that doesn't mean that you should use a blockchain for those transactions. Maybe it's just cheaper to rely on some trusted third party to update the ledger, in particular if it's someone that you can trust. But in situations where trust is difficult to get, then having a blockchain technology is very useful.
Hi, my name is Marcus Downing here with the Idaho Bitcoin Group. Just wanted to thank you for coming tonight and sharing your message with us and ask you a question about, from an investment perspective, what should we know about Bitcoin and its correlation to other assets?
So its correlation to other assets. Well, I should say I'm not a finance professor, so I'll put that out front, and I don't give investment advice aside from the very basic investment advice, which is diversify your portfolio, have low fee assets, and so I probably should just stick to that. But if you're interested in this, there is an economist, Gina Peterson, who's at the University of Chicago, who looks a lot at these kind of questions, fluctuations in Bitcoin's price. So I would direct you to her.
Yes, Professor Luther, I want to say thank you for coming to visit Boise State. My question is, with the creation of the CBOE and CMA futures last year, doesn't that create a new permanent asset class, that be cryptocurrencies, digital currencies? And if so, doesn't that create permanence, and then Bitcoin will never go away? Because we're at the 10-year mark and people have said that Bitcoin is going to disappear since day one, and obviously that's not true. Does that create permanence with that new asset class?
Well, so I don't know so much about permanence. There is some sense where Bitcoin is permanent. That is, it's an immutable ledger, right? And so in some sense it exists forever. And we don't want to commit that all or nothing fallacy, right? And so it's very unlikely that it goes to absolutely nothing, but there's something pretty close to nothing where people stop asking me to come talk about it and people like you stop asking questions. Right? And so that's really what we're concerned about, right? Is how big is this thing going to be? Not is it going to be zero. What I think that those futures contracts do is give us the possibility to hedge fluctuations in the price of Bitcoin. So I answered a gentleman over here's question earlier about the stability question, but the futures contracts give us another way to promote stability here. You and I can be more confident that in making long-term contracts in Bitcoin, if we can hedge against those using futures contracts, and so given that we can make those futures contracts, we're more likely to hold the asset, and since we're more likely likely to hold the asset is less volatile.
If I
than
could maybe
otherwise would.
expand on that, you don't picture in the future Federal Reserves purchasing Bitcoin like SDRs.
So the Fed has looked at using the blockchain technology more generally to process transactions. There's at least one economist, David Ondolfato at the St. Louis Fed, vice president of the St. Louis Fed, who has written on central bank issued cryptocurrencies. And the Bank of Canada has a whole team of economists looking at central bank issued cryptocurrencies. There have been experiments in this. I mentioned Venezuela. Ecuador issued a cryptocurrency for a while. Turned out that didn't work out so well, so it's pulling that back in. But there are central banks interested in blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. Would the Fed ever get to the point where it's purchasing Bitcoin? I want to say that that's unlikely. But if you'd asked me a little over a decade ago whether they would be purchasing mortgage-backed securities, I would have said that that was unlikely as well. And so the range of assets that the Fed has decided to purchase is much larger than it has been traditionally. I don't know that I would say it's going to go that large, but it's hard to say.
On a side note, actually, to answer the other gentleman's question earlier, voting was done on the blockchain in West Virginia for deployed overseas military servicemen.
I did not know that. That's
so
very
it was
interesting.
done, completed this year.
Huh.
Yeah. So my question is, what do you think about tokenization of assets such as real estate?
I talked a bit earlier about using this ledger technology for a lot of different things. I think that ICOs using initial coin offerings in lieu of traditional stocks is very interesting. It's a way of can I say this? Democratizing financial markets, right? Opening up financial
markets. I was referring to tokenized asset offering or security tokens offering.
For real estate?
Yes.
Yeah, so what do you have in mind? Do you have in mind issuing a cryptocurrency that's linked to a particular property? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then you can transfer titles to that property by transferring the particular token.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Much like using, transferring car titles. The question, anytime we're thinking about using the blockchain technology instead of traditional ledger technology, we have to ask whether or not it is less costly than the alternative. So let me answer by analogy. We all know that money is a useful technology because barter is pretty complicated. You have to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have. And so we use money instead of just trading good for goods because it's costly to trade good for goods. That's at least what we tell our principal students. In reality, we barter quite a bit, right? When we're choosing a spouse, for example. Right? You find someone who has what you want and wants what you have. Or when you're serving your kids breakfast, you don't typically charge them for their Cheerios, right? In those situations, we don't rely on money. In those situations, we have access to other technologies like norms and reputation effects, and we rely on those technologies to engage in exchanges with each other because those are high-trust, intimate relationships. In other transactions, more distant transactions, we can't rely on those norms, and so we have to rely on some other technologies like money. It's much the same thing when we're thinking about putting titles on a blockchain, right? Tokenizing real estate or automobiles. The relevant question is it cheaper to rely on trust in those situations? Now, we all know that if we rely on trust, we open ourselves up for our trust to be broken. Some marriages don't work out, and sometimes you have terrible kids. But right, most of the time it does work out in those situations, and so we use trust. It's actually more costly to keep a tally on how many times your husband did the dishes, and you don't want to do that, right? And so you just rely on norms. And so if we have access to some trustworthy entity that will manage that ledger more cheaply than we could do with a blockchain, then there's no reason to tokenize real estate or automobiles. If instead we're talking about high fraud areas, then certainly we want to consider tokenization. And so that's the question I would suggest that you attempt to answer when thinking about using the blockchain for a particular purpose. Is it better than the relevant alternative? And if so, why? Well, how does this lower the cost of processing these transactions? Can we do this with trust? If so, we don't need a blockchain. If trust is likely to be violated, then maybe this is a superior technology. So it might not be an all or nothing question, right? So maybe some countries, there are high trust countries. Maybe those countries, they just keep managing car titles and house titles like they always have. And sure, there's a little bit of fraud, but not so much fraud that it would be worth overhauling the system. And in other places where you're in a very low trust environment, maybe you say, look, this is not the kind of thing we can manage well. And so in order to get these transactions to actually take place, we're just going to put them all on a blockchain so to eliminate the fraud. Potentially at a higher cost, but a worthwhile cost considering that it eliminates the fraud.
My question, and maybe this was touched on a little bit in other questions, since you did mention Venezuela and the petrol, that seems to have failed, though that seems to be largely more due to Venezuela than necessarily blockchain or tying the currency to petroleum. My question is more about the general idea of tying a blockchain token to a metallic currency, like silver or gold, since basically all countries have abandoned that and moved to fiat money. Would that be a stabilizing effect for a blockchain currency or blockchain token if I could take that and say, here is 1,000 silver coins, give me $1,000 worth of silver coins?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying I think you're right about the petrol. When I think about the proposition here, Venezuela basically says, look, I know that you couldn't trust us to manage the supply of money, but you can trust us to manage the redemption of this digital asset for petroleum. Well, we can't trust you for that. So yes, there's not a lot of people willing to accept the petrol, it turns out. In terms of having a redeemable asset, so this is really what we're talking about. It's the same thing we were talking about in the previous question, tokenizing some asset. What you're saying is that, look, if we were to tokenize, say, some balance of gold, right, then we could just use those tokens as a medium of exchange, and the value of those tokens would then be governed by the supply and demand in the market for gold. Or silver, or some other commodity.
Because that also goes back to your previous comment about the ever-growing supply of tokenized currency like blockchain that we know for certain, or not maybe for certain, but we have a pretty good idea about how quickly its supply grows. The only question is demand. But when it comes to things like gold and silver, we actually have a pretty good idea about how much is on the earth at any given time and how much we can mine at any given time, how much is available versus how much is...
It's actually better than that. It's not just that that we can predict the supply of those assets, because, of course, we can't predict the supplies of those assets as well as we can predict the supply of Bitcoin. But why I say it's better than that is because the supply of those commodities, they vary based on the price of those commodities. And so one of the beautiful things about the classical gold standard, for example, is that when the demand for gold coins increased, the purchasing power of gold coins would be pushed up. And so then you have miners who are willing to dig a little deeper to bring more gold to market. And what does that do? Well, it puts the purchasing power of gold back down. And so over very long periods of time, while we were on the gold standard, you can see that the purchasing power of money was relatively stable. And that makes it very easy to engage in long-term contracting, because you know what the price of money is going to be, what the purchasing power of money is going to be in 10 years and 20 years and 100 years with a fair degree of confidence, because any disturbance in that purchasing power is automatically offset by the market for gold. And so there, it's not so much about being able to predict the price, but rather just having confidence that any variation in that price is going to set some forces in motion that ultimately pulls that purchasing power back to what it was before. And so even if you can't be confident in the long run supply, you can be confident in the long run purchasing power. And presumably that's closer to what we actually care about.
Also, though, one comment, because when you, in regard to the blockchain technology, you said part of the reason why it's better in some cases than others is the financial cost of blockchain versus traditional means. However, even if the traditional means are cheaper, one thing blockchain does is it can speed up processes. So like the New York Stock Exchange is looking heavily into blockchain, because if I sell you stock on the stock exchange, there's a thing called T3 or T2, which is how many days it takes for it to go through, for it to be looked at, versus blockchain, which is instantaneous. So even if the energy costs of blockchain or the upkeep and technological costs of blockchain are higher than the traditional methods, the instantaneous speed of it could outweigh those costs, depending on the situation you're talking about too.
Yeah, that's right. So earlier when I was talking about trust as being one potential margin on which you might want to rely on a blockchain technology, speed is another. The reality is that most of us don't need to clear our transactions instantaneously, but sometimes we do. Right, so you can think about it when you go to check out at Amazon, right? Maybe you're a Prime member, you'll automatically get that free shipping. But if you just wait a few more days, they'll give you a $5 credit. And sometimes you think, well, I don't want to wait a few days. And other times you think, I don't really need this right away. Right? And so if you're in a situation where you need something close to instantaneous clearing, then there's some scope for the blockchain technology, which does permit instantaneous clearing, to provide some usefulness that's not possible with those alternative mechanisms. I should say that SWIFT, which is an interbank a clearing process, has gotten much faster since Bitcoin launched. And so some authors think that those processing speeds are increasing because they fear competition from the blockchain. And so perhaps that's a benefit of having this blockchain technology.
I'm sure that Will was willing to take a couple of more questions, but in the interest of time, let's thank him for coming tonight.
Thank you very much.
If you have a question, you're certainly welcome to come up and talk to him. Thank you.